Welcome back, friends, to The World Unraveled with Brandon Kinnig. Your humble host is back and reporting live from the Principles First Summit. The fifth annual summit started as a gathering place for those who are anywhere from center to center right. That also now includes center left, the anti Trump, anti MAGA alternative. Originally started as principled conservatives, but now includes everybody that's part of the pro democracy coalition that wants to preserve the rule of law and our institutions in this country. And initially, I was very excited to be with you today, doing my podcast live from this momentous event, especially since this is my fourth year attending, and it started with a couple hundred people packed into the National Press Club building with handwritten name cards, name tags. And now we have over 1,200 in attendance at the JW Marriott. Unfortunately, want to get this out of the way first. There was an incident today, the first day of the conference yesterday. Enrique Tarrio, who's the leader of the Proud Boys, who was originally sentenced to 22 years in federal prison, but was pardoned by President Trump along with the other January 6th insurrectionist, was arrived at the hotel yesterday, and he actually confronted Officer Fanone and a couple of the other Washington, D.C. and Capitol police officers who were part of a panel speaking to the events of that day here at Principles First. So Enrico Terrio, who is now free, but had been charged in a assault incident just a couple days ago, assaulting a woman, but apparently was not held for very long and released. I think that was 2 days ago. He arrived at the hotel, was baiting Officer Fanone, trying to get a rise out of him, trying to start a fight, and this occurred in the hotel lobby. The conference itself is on the bottom floor, and there is a security perimeter this year with security checkpoints, and you have to have a badge to get past those checkpoints. And all devices, metals, backpacks, bags are searched and set aside. So Enrique Tario and his um, you know, just awful band of misfits did not get that far, but they were here yesterday before they were ejected by the hotel staff. Today, we have a bomb threat that's emailed by an account claiming to be Enrique T, associated with the Proud Boys Pro MAGA, um, claiming that there is a bomb here at the hotel, also threatening several specific individuals, including Officer Fanone, some of the other officers, including Ambassador John Bolton, who spoke here, and several other individuals whose homes were also had to be evacuated. So we had to evacuate the hotel. This has made national and international news at this point. But I bring this up to say that, these criminals are emboldened. They feel empowered. The felon in chief, who is now president once again, has given them new life. And, these people were welcomed actually at CPAC earlier this past weekend, and they made claims when they were, or I should say they made claims, but one of those individuals at CPAC actually said that they were received like gods at that event, which is just despicable. And many of these people received anywhere from 15 to 22-year sentences, which were vacated, barely served any time in jail by President Trump. So it's very despicable. And there are very few words to describe what happened today. And the intent was to intimidate and to terrorize. Unfortunately, they were not successful. Once the Washington Metropolitan Police were called and arrived at the hotel. They actually set up a perimeter, a block from the hotel. Nobody could get past. They checked for bombs. They cleared us. There was a loud cheer among the hotel attendees, all of us who had to vacate when we were allowed back in, and chants of USA. So that was a very proud moment. And we continued with our programming. We were about an hour and a half, 2 hours late, but the programming continued. We went longer, but all of the second day talks and panels and the uh, finale were able to wrap up, even going past the allotted time. And there were actually some attendees who changed their flights because they wanted to make a statement that they will not be cowed into fear by domestic terrorism and by people who think that they are now protected by the president, by the White House, and uh, and that there won't be any consequences. So we will not let them strike fear into us. It was a tense, scary moment. It was one that I thought was always possible in this climate with everything we've seen since Donald Trump was elected, returned to the White House. But we will not let these criminals intimidate us. We will not let the criminal who now is in the White House intimidate us. And that's all I have to say. But beyond that, it was very gratifying to meet like-minded people from all across the country, over 1,200 people in 44 states, and to hear them talk about their experiences and the ideas that they've learned here and to take those back home. What I wanted to focus on is just the events, though, that have happened in the last few weeks on Ukraine, and that started really at the Munich Security Conference, which I think this has been over a week ago now. Has it been 8 or 9 days now? I mean, time passes by so quickly now in the age of Trump with everything going on. So yeah, Munich Security Conference was February 16th. So we're about 8 days past. So for those of you who don't know, Munich Security Conference is the world's preeminent meeting that convenes around um, international security, resolving domestic conflicts, defense spending, and it has gone on now for um, 61 years. So it started in 1963, I believe, and it's been a mainstay for American political leaders, heads of state, to mingle, ambassadors, diplomats, and to discuss foreign policy, national security policy, in a very intelligent way, and particularly issues that face the NATO alliance as well. So I put that out there to just give some context. And typically, I don't want to say that the Munich Security Conference is a mundane affair. As I said, it's been going on in 1960 since 1963 in Munich, Germany. Um, and it's typically very much for policy wonks. Typically, 70 countries from around the globe participate, NGOs, international organizations, members of parliament, people from the armed forces. But it's an exchange of ideas. It's kind of like the Aspen Ideas Festival, which brings together policy leaders and business leaders from all areas, or South by Southwest, that conference is for tech. That's what the Munich Security Conference is for policy wonks as it relates to foreign policy and international issues and conflicts around the globe. And typically, you've had leaders like former secretaries of state Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright, Senator John McCain, the late Senator McCain was very much a mainstay at the Munich Security Conference, and they even have an award that they give out annually that's named in his honor. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger used to attend. Um, as a policy nerd and as a foreign policy geek, I would love to attend. It's one of the events that I have known about and tracked since I was about 11 or 12 years old. And if I could ever get an invite to one, I would be super happy. Probably, the like a kid in a candy store. But that is very unlikely. But this year's Munich Security Conference was anything but normal. Vice President J.D. Vance attended, and he blew up the conference by blasting European allies for being anti-free speech. He picked on them for their tech policies, specific countries like Germany for their anti-hate laws and anti-Nazi laws, which were, ironically, those laws were crafted in the aftermath of World War II to prevent a dictatorial Germany from ever rising up again and causing a world war. And the anti-hate speech laws were actually written by former President Eisenhower, then Supreme Allied Commander, as part of the rebuilding effort that occurred in Germany. But J.D. Vance criticized that. He criticized the way that the Europeans have handled migration and immigration and marginalizing extremist parties and locking them out of power. It was really a bizarre instance because he just unloaded completely on our allies for domestic laws and policies. And the other thing was that he claimed that the biggest threats they face are from within, which is ridiculous. We know that the magnitude of threats that Europe and the United States face are from China and Russia, who have no free speech of any kind. It was also notable that J.D. Vance snubbed meeting with the incumbent German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and instead he met with the leader of the far right extremist neo-Nazi party, the AfD, Alice Weidel, which again sends a message that America now is supporting this fringe party. He also made what I thought was a rather absurd comment that, quote, if American democracy can survive 10 years of Greta Thunberg scolding, you guys can survive a few months of Elon. The climate activist Greta Thunberg made a lot of pronouncements, but she had no policy role. She was not dictating policy or making laws. It's different than Elon Musk, who is practically co-president at this point, who is has his hand in all these different areas and of domestic and international policy, and who owns the world's largest social media platform, and who happens to be the world's richest man and has billions and billions of dollars, which he is using to influence elections to our peril. So it's a comparison that doesn't even pass the smell test by any means. Vance also, as I said, criticized the firewalls, but that Germany's main political parties on the right and the left, the CDU and the SPD, have put up against the neo-Nazi AfD, apparently oblivious to Germany's history because these firewalls, where the main political establishment in Germany has united to keep the AfD out of power, is a social agreement within Germany that's widely embraced because Germans, more than anybody, know their history. They know how populism and resentment led to the rise of fascism and eventually which took the form of the Nazi Party in Germany. And there's been a concerted effort culturally among the German population to prevent that from ever happening again. And so the German political establishment, civic establishment has held that firewall in place, and to their credit, is much more unified on something like that, and does not have the type of polarization that you would see in the United States. So it's a surreal moment to see the American vice president criticizing Germany's mainstream political parties for excluding a neo-Nazi party. And within all of this, in the context of all of this, it's so hypocritical for JD Vance to criticize European allies for their own domestic laws, which you can argue and quibble about a law here and there, but on the whole, none of the European countries that make up our NATO allies are anti-free speech. Like, free speech is practiced there. There are limitations, just as there are limitations on free speech in the United States. Speech that is threatening will result in a police visit, if not an arrest, uh, as well as speech that may ca- cause or forecast imminent harm to others, or speech that could result in civil penalties, such as libel and slander lawsuits. We have our own limitations on speech. It's not unlimited. Europe does too. Some European countries go a little bit further than we do, but the main essence of free speech in the context of being able to criticize the government, being able to criticize political leaders without fear of imprisonment, that is protected in Europe, just as it is in the United States. You know where that's not protected, though? It's not protected in Russia and Belarus, who J.D. Vance notably did not criticize while at the Munich Security Conference. Two countries who hold sham stage managed elections and have been ruled by the same leaders for decades, as well as Hungary, another country who he did not criticize because the MAGA right embraces, whose illiberal leader, Viktor Orban, has stifled free speech and the free press there and has remade the institutions, most of which are government owned now, and government run, including the media there. And so we live in a bizarro land where JD Vance goes over to Europe for this security conference, and instead of embracing our allies and reinforcing the strength of the NATO alliance and of liberal democracy, he wags his finger at them and just criticizes them to no end, scolding them while giving Russia, Belarus, and Hungary a free pass. So this didn't happen in a vacuum. Just a couple days prior to this, um, America's new DUI hire for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, made a statement where he said Ukraine could expect to reclaim its pre-war borders and it would remain outside of NATO. He had to backtrack on that some because, at least to their credit, a few Republican members of the House and Senate finally got a spine, including Senator Wicker of Mississippi, and push back on that, although they did it in the context of saying, I don't think he really meant that, and he's so new, he doesn't understand what he's doing. Well, perhaps this imbecile who's so new should have never been defense secretary, but that's neither here nor there. But it was remarkable for Hegseth to just immediately, put that out there, and basically tell Ukraine that they shouldn't expect to ever regain their sovereignty completely. Uh, the other notable thing was that at the Munich Security Conference, the Trump administration announced that Ukraine they basically presented President Zelensky of Ukraine with a proposal, a deal, which he had not seen before, um, asking Ukraine to give up half of its natural rare earth minerals to the United States. And there was a lot of pressure for Zelensky to sign this deal, which he had never seen. And he said he would have to study it. And this was proposed. And again, this is in line with how Donald Trump thinks about the world, right? Everything is transactional. There are no alliances that are built on common ideals like liberal democracy, free trade, rule of law. respect for human rights and the commonalities that we would share with the free world. No, it's all about tit for tat. What can you do for me? Everything is a transaction. So this pressure for Ukraine to give up half of its natural rare earth minerals results would result in no security guarantee. So there's no basis for Ukraine to agree to this. The United States didn't promise in exchange for this that they would protect Ukraine in the event of Russian aggression or that they would send troops to Ukraine. The laughable, ridiculous rationale that the United States gave for Ukraine to sign this is, hey, if you sign this, we won't make you pay us back for all of the aid that we've given you and all of the weaponry and all of the defense aid, equipment, missiles, tanks. We won't make you pay us back for any of that stuff. So, so it's a ridiculous deal, and Zelensky hasn't agreed to it yet. This also comes during the time when Trump announced that there would be bilateral talks between the United States and Russia for quote unquote ending the war with Ukraine. He announced this. And the irony of all this is that this deal was announced without any input from Zelensky or our European partners. In fact, Zelensky said he found out about it through the media, a quote unquote peace deal involving his country, which was attacked without him being involved or notified. And Secretary of State Marco Rubio flew to Saudi Arabia because that's where these discussions were held on the side of another brutal dictatorship. And the Europeans aren't included, and they have a direct stake in this. This is on their borders. In the case of uh, Poland and the Baltic states, it's right on their borders. But the reason that the U.S. gave for not including the European partners was that the multilateral talks back in um, 2022 and prior to that, even 2015, 2016, had it resulted in any sustainable peace. So that was the reason for not including them this time around, which again is a complete affront to our allies because they had nothing to do with Russia waging this assault. All of this is on Russia. The war could end tomorrow if Russia wanted it to. All it would have to do is withdraw their troops. They're uh, conducting drone attacks even today on Ukraine and killing people. But Trump announced that these unilateral talks would happen. It would be between the United States and Russia deciding the fate of Ukraine, apparently, which is incredible. And he also announced that the U.S. wanted um, economic trade to resume with Russia and would and ensure that our economies were linked, which is not something we need either. Russia needs us economically more than we need them. We don't stand to really benefit at all from trade with Russia. We don't need that linkage. And what Trump has done is he has given Putin equal footing and stature and welcomed Putin back into the free world as an equal partner. We have to remember Putin is a war criminal. He invaded, illegally invaded, and attacked a sovereign state and attempted to completely overpower it and make it part of Russia. He has been directly responsible for tens of thousands of civilian deaths in Ukraine. He has been responsible for the forced kidnapping of many Ukrainian children taken into Russia to be basically culturated as Russians and to grow up Russian. He has given the green light and allowed hospitals and schools and churches in Ukraine to be bombed. I could go on and on. The International Criminal Court has declared Putin a war criminal, which means he could be arrested if he sets foot outside of Russia and any democracy or NATO member state. So the idea that we would somehow treat him as an equal partner rather than arresting him and invite him onto American soil to be given a White House welcome, rolling out the red carpet as if he's this, you know, head of state on equal footing with any other democratically elected head of state is it's monstrous, it's despicable, it's offensive, and it basically shows that the United States has no moral compass now. We have relinquished our moral authority, and we just can't be trusted, is what this says. And I've never been so ashamed or embarrassed for our country on an international issue as I am with this 180-degree change and how we are treating Ukraine and vis-a-vis Russia. Essentially, we have switched sides in this war and taken Russia's side over Ukraine. But it doesn't even end there because Trump has gone on beyond this and made quite a lot of comments. Um, he recently lashed out. Of course, as you would expect, Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, has been very critical of this deal, which caused Trump to lash out at uh, Ukraine after sidelining our European allies and sidelining Ukraine in this process. Trump actually blamed Ukraine for starting the war that Russia started by invading them as a sovereign state, a completely unprovoked attack. He called Zelensky a dictator without elections, something he's never called Putin, who is an actual dictator. And he claimed Zelensky's approval was only 4%, even though the most recent public opinion poll by International Institute of Sociology in Ukraine showed that 57% of Ukrainians trust Zelensky, which is a higher approval rating than Trump even enjoys in the United States. And one thing I noticed that a lot of the media didn't pick up is that when Trump went on this rampage on Truth Social with Zelensky, he actually referred to the war as, quote, a war with Russia. He didn't say the war on Ukraine, the war against Ukraine, but he called it the war with Russia. This isn't a war with Russia. This is a Russian war on Ukraine. Ukraine did not declare war on Russia. Ukraine did not instigate or provoke an attack. This is a Russian war on Ukraine. Yet, in Donald Trump's warped mind, he sees it as a war with Russia. I mean, it's incredible. And there's so much to unpack here. But Elon Musk, his co president, also just retweeted and affirmed the whole dictator uh, claim, uh, calling Zelensky a dictator. Again, just completely feeding into the utter disinformation and abject lies. But the important thing to note, and there's a lot to note here, I think, is that we need to correct the facts on some things. MAGA just goes on talking about how much we've spent on Ukraine, and you'll often hear numbers. Elon Musk will throw out numbers like 350 billion that we've spent on Ukraine, which isn't even close. We've authorized 183 billion for Ukraine. Not even that much has been spent. That's what's been authorized. And the vast majority of our aid is in military equipment. It's not money that makes it to Ukraine. It's military equipment that's made here in the US. There are factories and factory workers here in Pennsylvania. This was highlighted during the presidential election last year. If you remember, Zelensky visited a factory and thanked the employees, and parts of MAGA right and Republicans in Congress got all up in arms because they thought it was a campaign visit because Zelensky had the audacity to thank Biden for his support of his country and thanking the factory workers for their support and producing the steel and metal that goes into making equipment as raw materials for equipment that for the war effort. So the majority of aid is in that equipment. And again, it goes without saying, if Russian soldiers would lay down their arms tomorrow, this war would be over. If Ukrainians just stopped fighting and and pulled back, they would Ukraine would cease to exist as a country. They would be wiped off the map. That's the difference. A friend of mine had posted on Facebook that if you're complaining about Zelensky following his constitution, yet you're saying nothing about the guy who literally assassinates his opponents, you really need to rethink your priorities. Zelensky did not cancel any election. The Ukrainian constitution actually mandates that national elections be postponed until after the end of 6 months after the end of martial law. Ukraine declared martial law when this war broke out back in 2022. And even if he didn't, can you imagine Ukraine attempting to hold a national election in the midst of Russian missile attacks? You have millions of Ukrainians that have been displaced. Poland alone has accepted somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 4 million Ukrainians, and other Ukrainians have fled the country to other European countries. So you have all of this displacement of people. You have people who are still in Ukraine, civilians, but have had to move to evade bombings and Russian missile attacks, especially in the east and the south. And so people aren't even at their residences where they're registered to vote. So how do you expect to track and to allow people to vote in a way that would not be utter chaos? It's impossible. And you have the Russians now, the invaders that control 20% of Ukraine. You think that the civilians that are left in those places of Russian controls are going to be able to vote safely and securely? Of course not. So it's stupid, and it's ignorant, and to even think that Ukraine could possibly hold a national election in the midst of a fighting a war of aggression against an invading country. And people have given comparisons that are just not on point. Saying, well, the U.S. held elections during the Civil War and World War I and World War II. During the Civil War, that was domestic between forces within our country and the United States, and the Confederacy had no Union territory. There weren't missiles and bombs going off; those hadn't been invented yet. There was no attacks by air. And also during World War I and World War II, there were no foreign invaders on US soil. So there was no interference that had to be contended with. There was no displacement of American civilians. We didn't have ICBMs then. We didn't have, uh, the drone warfare like we have now. And probably more accurate comparison is during World War II when the United Kingdom was bombarded by um, aerial attacks from Nazi Germany. Winston Churchill postponed elections, and they were postponed every year of World War II, and that was a democracy. Because again, when you're in a country under attack by a foreign power, you typically can't hold elections. That's something that just has to wait. So again, I feel like most of this is fairly common sense for most people and shouldn't have to be said. But apparently, there's enough Americans that live in the disinformation space and just spout this stuff off, and so we have to we have to reinstate it. I did forget something I wanted to mention earlier too. The utter hypocrisy of Vance going after European countries for quote unquote attacks on free speech at a time when this administration is ejecting AP reporters from the White House briefing room for using the term Gulf of Mexico. And they're suing Ann Selzer, the pollster in Iowa, for getting a poll wrong. I mean, talk about free speech. And they're scrubbing federal agency websites of banned words like inclusive and diversity. Those are banned now. And you could go on and on with this administration's just abject and downright total violations on free speech. So again, it's what's up is down and down is up. But it it's very disturbing what we're seeing happening with Ukraine, and Zelensky in particular, and the way that the Europeans have been shut out of this process entirely. The other thing, development just within the last day, because again, all of this has been last week. We still don't know the impact and the results of these unilateral talks between the Americans and Russians. This was headed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is another one who's just completely abandoned his prior principles and entire ideology and his proposed ideals. And he does look like somebody whose soul has just been sucked out of him. If you get a chance to look at photos of him, press photos have been taken in Saudi Arabia and as he's been in Europe, he doesn't look the same. He looks like a ghost. He looks like he's just a walking imitation of himself, really like a inhabiting a body he doesn't recognize. So, there's I can only imagine that somehow he's justifying that this is all worth it because he has this job that apparently he's always wanted. But is it worth it to sell your soul? His facial expressions and countenance seem to betray him. So I have a lot of questions about that. There's a UN resolution, though. This is what came about in the last day or two, that demands on Russia, um, demanding an immediate withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. And this is something we should have easily signed on to along with our European allies, but the US has refused to sign it. And they've actually pressured Ukraine to withdraw it. They've pressured Ukraine to withdraw a UN resolution calling on Russia to withdraw from their country, which would end the war essentially. Thankfully, Ukraine is standing strong. They are refusing to pull this draft resolution. Uh, and this comes as this coming Monday, tomorrow, will mark the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it also comes at a time when countries like Turkey, which granted are in the NATO alliance, but are not as free. Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has had autocratic tendencies. Like Turkey has never been, a country that has acted with moral clarity. But even Turkey came out and said that what's happening to Ukraine is unacceptable and that support for Ukraine must be upheld and that they have been grieved by Russia and that they were invaded. So, at a time when the United States is attempting to completely change the narrative and make it look like Ukraine started the war, Ukraine is the aggressor, Ukraine needs to end this, Ukraine's president is somehow a dictator. Turkey is saying the opposite. Again, we live in a bizarre world where this is the case, and we have relinquished our moral authority altogether. And countries like Turkey seem to have it when we don't. But we won't even sign on to this UN resolution supporting Turkey, which is something we would have easily done under the prior administration without blinking, as recently as last year. So uh, the United States now is trying to put forward an American resolution that does not criticize Moscow's invasion of Ukraine or even mention it at all. And I don't know what this resolution will say. If it doesn't even mention the invasion of Ukraine or condemn it, I don't know how. I mean, there's no way it's going to be effective. It's probably going to say nothing. Um, and it's probably been run by the Kremlin and approved by them. And anyway, it's crazy. It's extreme. These developments actually caused Emmanuel Macron, who's the president of France, to convene an emergency meeting while in Munich with other European leaders in the UK, Poland, Germany, uh, uh, to discuss how to handle Trump and this just, you know, about face by Trump regarding Ukraine and figure out a common message and common strategy for Europe uh, and how to best support Ukraine during this time. So things are changing rapidly. At this point, it's very conceivable that within a month or two, we would announce that we're leaving the NATO alliance. I mean, we've already began publicly abandoning our European allies. I mean, we dressed them down, and we're dressing up Russia as a potential ally and somebody who we want to do business with economically. And it's not that far off to see us abandon NATO too. So I expect that'll come. So again, this is a lesson in doublespeak, a lesson in authoritarian tendencies where you have the United States saying all they want is peace, but yet they're putting the onus on Ukraine to compromise its borders, its sovereignty, its liberty of its citizens to provide that peace. And there is no pressure on Russia to do anything. And Putin seems to be getting everything he wants. He's getting legitimacy on the world stage. He's apparently going to get economic ties with the United States. He is going to get a official state visit to America. What is he giving up? He hasn't been asked to withdraw even to like pre 2014 borders with Crimea, let alone give up any of the territory he's already taken. And if there's some peace deal where he gets to uh, continue to retain all of the territory seized from Ukraine since the start of this war, the 20% they have now, and including Crimea, which Russia took back in 2014 from Ukraine, then there's no concessions on the Russians. And what they've learned is that they can act with impunity and continue to do what they want. And it would not be a shock if they decide to invade one of the Baltic states, so Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia. So it's alarming, it's upsetting, and it's also ridiculous. You also hear the United States parroting the Russian line on trying to advance and find out the root causes to the war, and talking about how, trying to figure out who started the war is complex or who's responsible. No, it isn't. A sovereign state was invaded by an aggressor country that's an authoritarian dictatorship. There are no root causes beyond that. Putin has had designs on Eastern Europe for a while now. He has been outspoken in his view that Ukraine belongs to Russia, and that he laments the fall of the Soviet Union, the loss of Russian territory, wants to see a new Russian empire rise out of the ashes. And one thing I also want to dispel, it's been very alarming to see people parrot another Kremlin line. It's even some people very close to me in my family have parroted this line, which has shocked me, saying that we have pissed off Russia. We provoked them by even talking about Ukraine joining NATO because that was supposed to be off the table. That was never off the table. Ukraine joining NATO was something that was not on the table during the Cold War. But when the Iron Curtain fell, and we were supposedly in a new era with a hopefully democratic Russia, there was a thought that not only would Ukraine potentially join NATO, and the NATO alliance did enlarge and expand quite a bit after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So previous Soviet satellite countries like Poland and the former Czechoslovakia, which became the Czech Republic and Slovakia, were brought into NATO. And then that's when discussions first started about Ukraine joining, because even Russia was even looked at as possibly joining NATO at some point if they were going to become a friendly, outward-looking democratic state. Now, there was a um, Ford in 19, I think it was 1994. on the Budapest Memorandum is what it was called. So in 1994, there was an accord signed called the Budapest Memorandum, which basically set in motion provisions and security assurances by several states. And so Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, who were all former Soviet satellite states, signed the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, and Russia, the United States, and the UK also gave assurances. And the idea was these countries, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, agreed to give up their nuclear weapons stockpiles in exchange for um, these other nations, such as Russia, agreeing not to attack them or wage war against them. So each country agreed to respect all of the other signing nations' independence and sovereignty with their existing borders, refrain from the use of force, refrain from economic coercion, so trade blockades or sanctions, and and agree not to use nuclear weapons against any other non-nuclear weapon state party. So, with that in mind, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, which now in hindsight was likely a mistake because if Ukraine had nuclear weapons today, Russia would never have attacked it. Russia signed that Budapest memorandum and has obviously violated it because they attacked and invaded Ukraine. And so, in light of all of that, uh, I think that it has to be recognized that Ukraine was never a threat to Russia, had never provoked Russian anything, and if anything, they made a heavy concession after the fall of the Iron Curtain and the end of communism in Europe and the fall of the Soviet Union, a heavy concession by giving up their nuclear weapons, predicated on agreement with Russia, and that Russia would abide by that agreement and treat them with respect and not attack them. And Russia just has shredded that agreement completely. And the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO once again became something that needed to be considered as Putin took control of Russia and gradually, quickly in some aspects, but still gradually turned it into an authoritarian regime, not much unlike the former Soviet Union. So that's where we're at today, and it necessitated, and that's why, to their credit, the Biden administration were able to build an alliance to support Ukraine in this war, but also bringing Sweden and Finland into the NATO alliance. That occurred because those countries suddenly felt vulnerable and said, well, if this could happen to Ukraine, in the case of Finland, they share a border with Russia. And Sweden is very close. They're on the Scandinavian peninsula. And Sweden had long been a neutral country, but they felt like this aggression by Russia was a turning point and they had to respond. So countries' actions change, thoughts and security postures change with, changing events. And Russia really set all of this into motion. So there's no excuse. Even talking about Ukraine joining NATO isn't an excuse for or a cause for provocation for Russia to invade the country. But it's very bleak. We have changed sides in this war. It remains to be seen whether or not the Senate and the will push back against this or, you know, demand that the sanctions remain in place because Donald Trump is very set to remove sanctions on Russia, which have hurt the Russians. It hasn't hurt them as much as we hoped, but the Russians would be very happy to have those sanctions removed tomorrow. And the Senate is and Congress are the only ones who can push back on that. Otherwise, the Russians are liable to get everything they want in this deal with the United States, where we basically give up large swaths of Ukraine, all in the name of finding peace, uh, peace through appeasement, which never works in the long term. And if you question that, um, go back in history and ask Neville Chamberlain how well that worked out. And on that note, I will go ahead and end this podcast. Thank you all for being here today. I am signing out from Washington, D.C., and I will join you all back home in Kansas City for the next podcast. Stay safe.